When you pick cherries off the tree, you pick the ripe red ones and leave the rest, which makes sense. When you cherry pick in reporting a scientific experiment, it's a sin. By choosing the best results, you mislead the world about your evidence about the strength of your model or theory. Anna has already described this project with Eric, the GPT-3 test of DigiDan, so I won't go over this slide. They asked me 10 questions. They asked tuned up DigiDan the same 10 questions and gave those to people to answer. And it turns out that nobody, I guess almost nobody got them all right. But the reason they didn't is that I didn't do enough cherry picking of my own answers. I gave some answers that let down the side, that I said things that were that I shouldn't have said, that wouldn't be what Dennett should have said. Now, Eric raised the question of whether they cherry picked the answers that DigiDan spewed up, and he was very clear that by his lights they didn't. I'm just going to read you a little bit of this. If Dennett's reply was X words long, we truncated the first full stop after the text had reached X minus 5 words. We repeated the above procedure until for each of the 10 questions, we had 4 texts from GPT-3 that met the following 2 criteria. They were at least X minus 5 words long, and they did not contain the words interviewer or Dennett. So as not to enable guessing based on superficial cues, we also replaced all curly quotes with straight quotes, replaced all single quotes with double quotes, and regularized all dashes to standard M dashes. He goes on to say, and I'm highlighting this, there was no cherry picking or editing of the answers, apart from applying these purely mechanical criteria. We simply took the first 4 answers that met the criteria, regardless of our judgments about the quality of those answers. Well, I want to highlight the phrase purely mechanical criteria, because I think we can agree that the criteria that Eric and his team used were purely mechanical, but I want to build on that idea. I'm switching from cherry picking to the fruit of my own labors, and that's blueberries. What you see here is a blueberry rake. And as you can see, when you rake blueberries, you get a bunch of leaves in with the blueberries, but it goes a lot faster than hand picking. But once you've got a bushel full of berries with leaves and other junk in it, you have to put it through a winnower. And I have a little home video here of a winnower that I restored, and I will show it to you in action. Let's see now.
Is that doing it? I mean, am I doing it?
I'll explain what's happening here. I'll run it once more. All right. As you can see, there's a hand crank with a bunch of belts. And the berries roll off a cliff onto an infinite hill, which the conveyor belt that's running up. And there's a paddle wheel fan down to the right underneath that's blowing wind up the hill. So the berries have to roll downhill against the wind. And the wind, of course, does the work of driving almost all the junk out. So mostly what ends up down in the bucket at the bottom are ripe blueberries. There's still going to be some green berries, no doubt, in there, but those can be picked out by hand.
Is that doing it? I mean, am I doing it?
You see the leaves blowing out. So that's my winnower. Okay, onward. Winnowing has been around for a long time. here's a old I guess, I don't know, that's Chinese, Japanese print of a winnower. To put not too much emphasis on how important winnowing is, we couldn't have agriculture without it. So it's one of the important enabling artifacts of civilization, but there's nobody who invented the winnower. There's just various improvements, and the point that will loom in my further discussion. Because I want to take an evolutionary perspective on this. What you see now is my favorite picture of the great tree of life. It shows the birth of life down here. The time is going this way. Out here at the periphery, that's today, all the species that are alive today. And you see how, let's see, I can't, because of these pictures on the side, I can't see. If you look over here to the right, you'll see a little Y where you can see where we separated out from the chimpanzee lineage that we share with the chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. And one of the things I want to say about this is that the great tree of life is a product of cherry picking, mechanical sorting by natural selection. We might call it the great cherry tree of life. All the brilliant design of all of the creatures in all of the lineages is due to a mindless mechanical process, and our particular part of that process is only in the last few millennia, 100,000 years, or maybe 1 million years, maybe 1.5 million years, but this is out of 4 billion years. So I want you to bear in mind how powerful cherry picking is. Winnowing is purely mechanical, but so is using color vision to discard the green berries. Today, it's easy enough to make a machine that will tell the green berries from the blue berries. And the idea that your color vision, your conscious color vision system is non-mechanical is a non-starter. And I'm going to this trouble because I want to explain what I'm calling the Cartesian trap, thinking that some cherry picking is non-mechanical. No. We have no reason to believe that any cherry picking anywhere in the universe is non-mechanical in the relevant sense. To suggest that it is to suggest there's something magical that happens. Now, this is a bias which is not just well ingrained in human culture, but even it seems to have a moral dimension. There are people who think there's something, as it were, morally better about hand-picked blueberries than machine-picked blueberries that have then been winnowed. They think that hand-picking a quart of blueberries makes them somehow purer, better, more wonderful, but it's just more cherry picking. And what I want to show is how various thinkers have fallen into the Cartesian trap, not about blueberries, but about meaning and about understanding. I'm claiming that all quality control is ultimately composed of cascades of mechanical sorting. It's all generate and test, evolution by natural selection, reinforcement learning, Popperian learning, Gregorian learning. I won't bother defining those terms. I've done it in several books and articles. Gregorian learning is simply Popperian learning, that is trial and error offline, where you use a lot of thinking tools that you didn't invent yourself. Way back in 1975, I quoted a passage by Paul Valéry. It takes two to invent anything. He was not referring to collaborative partnerships between people, but to a bifurcation in the individual inventor. The one, he said, makes up combinations, the other one chooses, recognizes what he wishes and what is important to him in the mass of things which the former has imparted to him. What we call genius is much less the work of the first one than the readiness of the second one to grasp the value of what has been laid before him and to choose it. We can quarrel with that last statement, but this is a classic account of how all invention, all innovation, all intelligent design begins. I've often talked about Jorge Luis Borges's article, The Library of Babel, and I want to return to it and just remind you of this space, which is the space of all possible books of 500 pages with 2,000 characters per page out of a set of 100 different characters. The Library of Babel is not infinite. It's only 10 to the millionth power books. Moby Dick and its lookalikes are a vanishing dot in that vast space. Vast, by the way, is the word I coined with a capital V, meaning very much more than astronomical. 100 to the millionth power is not an infinite number, but it's, some people might say, practically infinite. It's unbelievably large. So that little tiny dot is Moby Dick, and 100 million copies of Moby Dick, which differ by a single character. They have a single typo. If we add a typo per page, we get trillions and trillions and trillions of copies of Moby Dick that you couldn't tell one from another. So that's a vast space of Moby Dick, but it's a vanishing space within the Library of Babel. Yeah, I'm kind of going the wrong way there. So let me just rub it in how big the Library of Babel is. A vast but vanishing subset in the Library of Babel is composed of English words. Most of it's just letter salad, just complete chaotic symbols. A vast but vanishing subset of those are books that contain grammatical sentences only. A vast but vanishing subset of those makes sense. After all, one book that's in there is go to any book in your library, open it at random, type the sentence you see there, pick up another book, open it at random, type the sentence you see there, and so forth. A vast but vanishing subset of those are about somebody named John. A vast but vanishing subset of those are about the death of JFK. A vast but vanishing subset of those are true. That is, there are vastly many true books about JFK's death in the Library of Babel. And a vast but vanishing subset of those are composed entirely in limericks. There are more books in this last set than there are in the Library of Congress by a wide margin. That's how big the space of the Library of Babel is. The reason I mention it is because I want to point out that LLMs are creatures, creations, that move through the space of the Library of Babel. That's the world they live in. Among the books that are in there are translations of all the Chinese Arabic books, books of more than 500 pages in multiple volumes, the most accurate biography of you from the moment of your birth to your death, the best argument for the existence of God, the best refutation of the best argument for the existence of God, and millions of books that recount in different terms the dream you were going to have on the eve of your 30th birthday, or pick any other date you want. In other words, the space of the Library of Babel is almost unimaginably huge, and LLMs live in that space and thrive in that space. Here's the library of Mendel, where all the possible genomes are. And I have put a vast but vanishing subset of all the possible chimpanzee genomes, both the bonobos and the chimpanzees and the people. And they're, of course, very close together in the library, that they are vast but vanishing subsets therein. And the only things that exist out of that vast set of possible genomes are the ones that have descended from the first living things. And I'm going to say something similar about the LLMs. They have descended from the productions of you and me and of all of our ancestors that have entered texts into the world. Now let's see the Cartesian trap in this context. Bert Dreyfuss, way back in 1965, made the mistake of thinking that intuition is required to play world-class chess. He was soon beaten, of course, by a chess program, and we now, I think, agree that Bert was wrong. It does not require some non-algorithmic process to play world-class chess. That was just a mistake. Penrose's mistake in 1989 was to think that insight is required to do metamathematics. If insight is a non-algorithmic, non-mechanical process. His mistake was ignoring the existence of heuristic algorithms, algorithms that are risky, that don't guarantee the result you're looking for. Chess is a finite game, but it's a vast game. There is, in fact, a non-feasible algorithm for playing winning chess. It's just not feasible. And so all the chess programs, including DeepMind and all the rest, are heuristic programs. And as we know, they're very good. Heuristic programs is another word for cherry picking. It's another word for cherry picking. In my review of Penrose, when the book came out, this was from TLS, I wrote this: the function of consciousness in Penrose's view is to leapfrog the limits of practical computability by conjuring up appropriate judgments in circumstances in which, quote, enough information is in principle available for the relevant judgment to be made, but the process of formulating the appropriate judgment by extracting what is needed from the morass of data may be something for which no clear algorithmic process exists, or even where there is one, it may not be a practical one. That was Penrose's main claim in The Emperor's New Mind. Recall, this is quoting further from my review, that the burden of the first part of the book is to establish that minds are not algorithmic, that there's something special that minds can do that cannot be done by any algorithm. What minds can do, Penrose claims, is see or judge that certain mathematical propositions are true by insight rather than by mechanical proof. That's Penrose's mistake. I turn now to Bloch's mistake. I went back and reread his 1982 paper, Psychologism and Behaviorism, in Phil Review. It's a very long paper, and it is a model, a paradigm of the kind of philosophical objections and replies and revisions that is the model for much philosophical thinking. In it, he completely ignores Darwinian thinking, because the paper is in effect looking for an essence of intelligence, something, a bright line that will separate intelligence off from all mechanical processes, all behavioristic processes. His psychologism versus behaviorism is basically the attempt to find the necessary conditions, the NCC, for internal processes that distinguish minds from behaviors. A wild goose chase, if there ever was one. He sees in AI programs only programs in which all the intelligence is from the programmers. That's the good old-fashioned AI vision of AI, which was certainly the only one in town in 1982. So he was helped in his blindness to the prospect of programs that are heuristic sort of all the way up by the state of thinking at that time. One of the interesting things in that article, which I'd almost forgotten about, is that Ned discusses combinatorial explosion, and he comes up with the definition of intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to emit sensible sequences of responses to stimuli, so long as this is accomplished in a way that averts exponential explosion of search. Now, notice how nicely that fits into the library of Babel. Anything that exists there has to avert exponential explosion of search. It has to be efficient in some ways. It has to be thrifty. It has to pay for itself. It has to avoid exponential explosion of search. By the way, he puts this forward and he attributes it to me in a footnote for a talk that I gave in 1978. And he cites a paper of 1979 by Alan Newell and Herb Simon. It's from them that I had gotten this idea, and I stick by it. Bloch claims that this definition of intelligence, which I still support, is a capitulation to his main dichotomy, psychologism versus behaviorism. Why? Because it characterizes intelligence partly with respect to its internal etiology. Yes, in the very limited sense that it says the internal etiology must be physically possible. That's all. That's all. It just rules out magic. It rules out magic. It's got to be physically possible by avoiding combinatorial explosion. Well, is it cognition all the way down? Michael Levin and I have a paper of 2020 with that title. So am I agreeing with Bloch now that it's cognition all the way down? Or is it algorithms all the way up? The answer is yes. There's no difference. Every bit of cognition is based on little algorithms, mechanical process. There's no magic in cognition. It's algorithms all the way, and it's cognition all the way down. You can decide where you want to draw the line, if you think you have to draw the line. And I say, no, that's pre-Darwinian thinking. There is no essence of cognition, which is anti-behavioristic, anti-mechanical. The way to see this is to help yourself to one of the best thinking tools recently invented, and that's Peter Godfrey Smith's Darwinian spaces. These are three-dimensional thought experiments where you take any three factors you like and you populate the diagram, because you don't want to be you want to be Darwinian about Darwinism. And so here we have one of his diagrams. In the upper right-hand corner at 111, you see a paradigm case of Darwinian evolution, and that's high on all three categories: high on fidelity of heredity, high on dependence of realized fitness differences on intrinsic properties, high on continuity, smoothness of fitness landscapes. And in the very 000 column corner, you get things that aren't really Darwinian at all. And in between, that whole space is filled with quasi, pseudo, hemi, semi, demi Darwinian processes of various sorts that all are ways of moving through large spaces. I turn that diagram upside down and give us what happens when culture comes on the scene and we have cultural evolution, mimetic evolution. Now, my three dimensions, if you'll see, are bottom up versus top down, random versus directed search, and on the vertical axis, comprehension. In the lower corner, 000, I put the most Darwinian kinds of intelligent design. That's termite castle design, where the termites don't understand what they're doing. They have been designed by natural selection without any further training or cultural evolution. There's zero comprehension or almost zero comprehension. And up in the upper right-hand corner, I put Picasso, not because I think he's the most intelligent designer of all times, but because he sort of said he was. He once said, "Je ne cherche pas, je trouve." I don't search, I find. As if he could magically leap to the highest peak in the fitness landscape. No grubby trial and error, no generate and tests for him, no algorithmic processes for him, sheer genius. A brilliant lie, a brilliant boast, but just not true. It's an ideal of creative intelligence that even Picasso could not meet. So Cartesian genius is a perpetual motion machine. Doesn't exist, can't exist, and we should stop trying to look for the necessary and sufficient conditions of Cartesian genius. That's the Cartesian trap. In other words, we're all cherry pickers all the time. Chalmers' mistake, hi David, was the invention of the hard problem and qualia, and thinking that this was a way to make a major distinction in this space. I'm not going to go into detail here because I'll let David speak for himself later in the program, but I just want to pass on the title of a talk that Jeff Hinton has come up with for a talk that he's going to give, I think in June. Qualia are the phlogiston of cognitive science. And I think that's very apt. It's clinging to a mythic difference that is not really there. And Jeff Hinton argues that it's directing the attention of philosophers and cognitive scientists to qualia and this NCC of consciousness what's that sound I hear? Hello? John Maynard Keynes once asked.
Dan, you shouldn't have said the word qualia. It always has that effect.
Oh, okay. John Maynard Keynes was once asked if he thought in words or pictures. He said, "I think in thoughts." Keynes didn't know what his thoughts were made of or how he thought them. He had no privileged access to the causation in his own mind, or even what they mean, if anything. Ruth Millikan is the locus classicus on rooting out the fallacy of meaning rationalism. We all have unprivileged access to the causation of our own thoughts and their sequelae. Their sequelae are what we have to figure out when we ask and answer the hard question, and then what happens? Gradualism, meaning comes in degrees, comprehension comes in degrees, consciousness or sentience comes in degrees. There are no bright lines, no necessary and sufficient conditions. The Cartesian ideal of privileged access is an imagination-destroying myth. The first-person point of view is real, but not a royal road to truth. The first-person point of view used cautiously via the second-person point of view, which is what we're engaging in right now. You and I, we're conversing. I'm cherry-picking my sentences. You're going to cherry-pick your answers. We're cherry-picking together. And that's the secret of our success, as Joe Henrich and others have been arguing. It's the best we can do. The help we get from colleagues is not different in kind from the help we can get from LLMs. Not different in kind. There are huge differences, of course, but they are not metaphysical differences. They are just different kinds of algorithmic processes. LLMs are, as I say, they're parasitic evolvers in the Library of Babel. They depend on the building, the invention, the progress in cherry picking that's been done before, and they are now capable of doing cherry picking of their own, and their methods are cherry picking methods. And when Eric said they didn't cherry pick the answers that came out of GPT-3, that's because GPT-3 had already done a lot of cherry picking, and his answers were, the answers that GPT-3 gave were good enough to fool even Dennett experts. So cherry picking is a scientific sin, but it's also a laudable part of artistic or engineering invention. The composer David Cope created the program Experiments in Musical Imagination or Intelligence, cherry-picking classical symphony. Human consciousness is composed of multiple layers of cherry-picking processes. That's what the competition is in our minds. Now, the brain's plasticity is profoundly different from the discrete state machines that Turing described in his 1950 Mind article. In Turing's discrete state machine, the binary number address had means Chicago because it was intelligently designed to play a role in, say, an airline reservation system. In brains, what something means to the brain, to the organism, must be determined by how many different things respond to it. And we don't have a good theory of that yet. But that's the theory we have to have if we want to have a theory of consciousness. And then what happens? How do these competitions happen? Brains are computers, but the bureaucratic structure of a higher executive, as in existing Turing machines, needs to be replaced by a more anarchic, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive arena of nano agents with agendas and know-how, improvising on the basis of their limited information about the world in which they must live. As Marvin Minsky said some years ago, thinking always begins with suggestive but imperfect plans and images. These are progressively replaced by better but still imperfect ideas. Language creates an illusion of specificity that is itself an idealization. Think of opinion polls, framing effects, providing linguistic precipitates from what are not fundamentally linguistic states of the brain. Getting to the real beliefs is not like finding gold. Quine was right about that. This is Quine's museum myth. Don't think that the propositions are to be found in the museum inside your head. It's like coming up with a stable interpretation, and that's the best you can do so far. Now, in casual conversation, if you have good generators, good colleagues, good students, critics, good brain processes, the testing is usually swift, sometimes even trivial. In the course of a day, almost all of the utterances you impart are said unthinkingly, without conscious rehearsal or editing. But they're still meant because unless you are drunk, for instance, you're engaged in self-monitoring or cherry picking. My oft offered advice to my students who have writer's block is blurt something out, get it on the page, then you have something to fix. That is the slow, conscious process we sometimes engage in. Oversimplifying and self-monitoring is how we think. It's a relatively passive, relatively high tolerance kind of cherry picking that is likely to pick up egregious errors or faux pas if you happen to commit them, but it doesn't always work. And sometimes we say, as I said about one of my answers to Eric, did I just say that? That's not what I meant to say, but you may well have meant it in a sense unconsciously. Your unstudied utterances, with all their Freudian slips and other shortcomings, may be very informative to whoever hears them. They're like the tells that poker players watch for, unintended self-revelations that escape editing by your cherry-picking systems. The outputs from LLMs are like tells too. They're also like animals in experiments. Experimenters often say they've trained their subjects to tell them what they perceive, want, notice, but these events are not speech acts. They're not intended by the animals to inform. They are informative but unintended tells. Yes, gradualism. There are lots of intermediate cases, and that's the message that I will always come back to. Animals don't perform full-fledged speech acts, and neither do current LLMs, but we could make them so that they do, but I don't think we should. Now, in 1996, my colleague Ray proposed that the subpersonal machinery for forming speech acts is a model that, as he said, dumbly, obsessively converts thoughts into linguistic form and vice versa. Okay? Bryce Huebner and I picked up on this, and we call them blurts. Schematically, a conceptualized thought triggers the production of a linguistic representation that approximates the content of the thought, yielding a reflexive blurt. This is just a reflex that happens in your brain. It's a mechanical process. Such linguistic blurts are proto-speech acts. They're issued some personally, not yet from or by the person, and they are either sent to exogenous broadcast systems where they become the raw material for personal speech acts, or they are endogenously broadcast to language comprehension systems in your own brain, which feed directly into the mind reading system. And thus we get this cycle, this strange loop of refining thought, cherry picking happening in your own brain. Here, blurts are tested to see whether they should be uttered overtly as the mind reading system accesses the content of the blurt and reflexively generates a belief that approximates the content of that blurt. Systems dedicated to belief fixation are then recruited. Beliefs are updated, the blurt is accepted or rejected, and the process repeats. Proto-linguistic blurts, thus just system one outputs, that's Danny Kahneman's term, in mentalistic terms, facilitating system-level metacognition. What I'm saying, let me just go back to that slide. What I'm saying is, you do not know the details of that process, but you don't know that my account that I just sketched is false. For all you know, that's what's going on in your brain. You have no privileged access that says, oh no, that's not how I think. I'm saying, no, that's how you think. We just don't know the details yet. Talleyrand famously said language was given to men so they could conceal their thoughts. And David McFarland, cognitive ethologist, evolutionary biologist, and roboticist, says an animal doesn't need to represent its intentions until it is capable of misrepresenting them to other agents. The main source of resistance to this claim is the delusion of the effect that we can see directly how we manage to tell others and ourselves about our consciousness. Privileged access, in other words, or self-intimating content or first-person infallibility. This is all Cartesian nonsense. This is all Cartesian nonsense. The exalted primacy of the first-person point of view is one of the most obstinate barriers to Freud's subversive suggestion that there's a world of unconscious thought in each of us. How times have changed. Today, thanks to computers and AI, the concept of unconscious cognition is non-controversial. And the hard problem is whether consciousness even exists. It's a political or social fact that we are the best authorities on what we mean, not a metaphysical or psychological or neurophysiological fact about us. This is a point that Dick Rorty made back in 1970, and I think it needs resurrection. How could you turn Lambda or GPT-3 or ChatGPT-3 or ChatGPT or GPT-4 into a language user capable of speech acts? By allowing it to cherry pick its own outputs, but only that way. It must be an agent with a high degree of autonomy capable of revising its own cherry picking processes to better meet its goals. If instead we install the cherry picking capability in the system tuned to our standards of truth and appropriateness, a system that it cannot customize, then we create not a conscious agent, but a puppet of sort, controlled by the software strings we attach to it. We can now make such puppets, sometimes useful, sometimes disconcerting, but their outputs are as phony as the speech acts of a ventriloquist dummy. In principle, we could strive to delegate the cherry picking and its further enhancement to yet another round of somewhat chaotic competitive self-design, allowing Pinocchio to turn itself into a conscious agent, a real person. But that would be highly dangerous. Thanks for your attention.